Part 1.
You will hear a conversation between a senior librarian and a woman interested in working at the library. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 7. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 7.
I'm interested in doing some work for the library. Are you the person to speak to?
Yes. Right. Well, what sort of work are you interested in?
Well, I've just come to live here in Australia. I don't want a full-time job until my children have settled down, but I really need to get out of the house a bit. And I heard you need voluntary workers for various projects.
Right.
But I don't know if I have the right skills.
Well, we do provide training.
Oh!
We always include an orientation to the library, together with emergency procedures. That's fire regulations, emergency exits, first aid so you can cope with accidents or sudden illness. Things like that which are necessary for anyone who's working with the public. Then we give specialist training for particular projects, like using our database system.
I do have quite good computer skills, in fact.
Oh, great.
Is there any sort of dress requirement?
Well, all staff have to wear a name badge, so they can be identified if they go outside the staff-only areas. But apart from that, there aren't many regulations. We ask you to sign in and sign out for insurance purposes, but that's all. How about transport? Do you live locally?
Well, not too far away. I'm at Porpoise Beach. My husband needs a car during the day, but it's only about 20 minutes on the bus.
In fact, we can reimburse part of your travel expenses in that case.
Oh! Would that be the same if I came by car?
No, because parking is such a problem here. One thing we are looking for, though, is someone who can drive a minibus.
No problem. So, do the projects involve going outside the library?
Some, yes, but not all. We've just finished one which involved working with photographs taken of the area 50 or 100 years ago. It basically involved what we call encapsulation.
Putting them in some sort of covers to keep them safe?
Exactly. It's time-consuming work, and we were very grateful to have help with it. Then, sometime next year, we're hoping to begin working on an initiative involving the sorting and labelling of objects relating to local history. We'll be needing help with the cataloguing.
Oh, I'd definitely be interested. How about at present?
Well, we have a small team who work to support those who are unable to read.
Working with the blind?
Yes, or other groups who have reading difficulties. We provide volunteers with equipment so that they can take books home with them and read them aloud onto CDs. We're gradually building up a collection that can be lent to those who need them.
I can see it would be useful, but I'd really like to do some sort of work where I can get the chance to meet people. How about reading stories to children?
That's done by our regular staff. But we do have another project. It's a very long-established scheme which involves helping those who are unable to have direct access to the library.
Oh, I noticed someone with a trolley of books when I was at the hospital last week. That sort of thing.
That would have been one of ours, yes. It's one of our most popular services. Lots of people who wouldn't dream of going to the library normally when they're at home borrow a book when the trolley comes round the ward.
I can imagine. Yes, I'd definitely be interested in that. Right, so how do I enrol?
Well, we do ask all volunteers to commit themselves to a regular period each week.
I could probably do 5 or 6 hours.
Oh, be careful not to take on too much. But we do need someone for a couple of afternoons from 2 to 4, so 4 hours altogether.
That sounds fine.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, Now listen and answer questions 8 to 10.
Right, so here's the application form. It asks the usual questions, name and address and telephone number. You also need to fill in details of who we should get in touch with in case of any accident or problem like that. We do need to have that filled in. And there's a space for date of birth, but that's only if you're over 75, so we won't worry about that.
No. Oh, it asks for qualifications. Do I need to provide certificates?
They're not necessary. We'll need the names of 2 referees, not relatives or family members, obviously. What else? Signature of parent or guardian. That won't be necessary, as I assume you're over 18.
Yes. What's this? It says civil conviction check.
That's a document we have to provide by law for those working on projects involving children, so we won't need it in your case. But you will need to sign this separate document. That's a copy of commitment. It's basically an agreement to work according to the library guidelines. So, if you'd like to fill this all in, you can do it here or take it home, whichever you prefer.
I'll take it home if that's okay. Right, well, thank you for your time.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
Part 2. You'll hear a tutor and 2 students discussing modern European writers. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 16. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 16.
Okay, so to continue our look at modern European writers who have focused on the future in their work, today we're talking about H.G. Wells. Last week, I asked you both to do some background research on Wells, which we're going to discuss now. Gitanjali, tell us about H.G. Wells.
Right. So, H.G. Wells was a hugely successful British science fiction writer, writing at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th century, and much of his work focused on predicting the future.
Jason, do you think Wells was just using the future as a narrative device in his fiction?
No. He really believed we can predict the future. In fact, he gave a speech at the Royal Institution in London in 1902 called The Discovery of the Future. And the point he was making was that by looking at what you know about the present and about science, it's quite possible to predict the future.
Indeed. Gitanjali, do you think Wells was always optimistic in his predictions?
Not at all. In fact, he varied in his predictions from being extremely pessimistic about the future to being optimistic. Interestingly, one theory I read links the attitude in Wells's work to his own health. When he was writing The Time Machine, which was published in 1895, he'd just been diagnosed with an incurable fatal disease. Not surprisingly, the book is very pessimistic, being about a dystopia in the future, a long time in the future, the year 802-701 in fact, where there are 2 races on Earth, the Morlocks and the Eloi, and the Morlocks actually eat the Eloi.
I thought it was interesting, though, that it was H.G. Wells who actually came up with the phrase time machine. So despite being pessimistic, the work has had a lasting effect on our culture.
Right. After the time machine, though, H.G. Wells didn't die, of course. And his recovery might be why he began to be a bit more optimistic about the future.
So that brings us to his first utopia, Anticipations. Jason, tell us about that.
Well, Anticipations, or to give it its full title, Anticipations of the Reaction of the Mechanical and Scientific Progress upon Human Life and Scientific Thought, was published in 1901 and was set in the New Republic of the year 2000. Some of the things Wells predicts are fairly close to our reality today, including 24-hour news, global telecommunications, and even a European Union.
We'll come back to the accuracy of Wells's predictions a little later. Gitanjali, how was Wells's work received at the time?
Well, although Wells was extremely successful, not everyone respected his work or his predictions. Another well-known science fiction writer, Jules Verne, viciously attacked him for works such as The First Man in the Moon, which Verne argued weren't rooted in scientific fact at all.
That's right. Now, Wells wrote a number of other utopian visions of the future. Jason?
Yes, in A Modern Utopia, published in 1905, his vision was of a world where there's no private property, where everyone has access to wonderful healthcare, and interestingly, where everyone's personal information is stored on cards in a central database outside Paris. Apart from the healthcare, I'm not sure everyone today would see that as a positive view of the future.
Neither am I. And, on a similar note, Wells strongly believed in population control and in The Shape of Things to Come, which was published in 1933, he sees and supports a world where the population is kept at 2 billion. Once again, I'm not sure most people today would necessarily see that as a good thing.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 17 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 17 to 20.
Gitanjali, in your research, did you come across anything about the world brain?
Yes, I did. It's actually very interesting. Throughout the 1930s, Wells predicted and supported the setting up of a huge world encyclopedia. And towards the end of the decade, in 1938, he wrote a series of essays called World Brain. In these essays, he called for the world to make use of modern technology to create an enormous global encyclopedia so that all our knowledge is available to all people, not just an educated elite. Wells envisioned this as probably being on microfilm. He thought it would allow anyone, anywhere in the world, to look at any book or any document. He also thought it would be created by everyone, once again, not just by an elite.
Yes, and as you can imagine, many people today say that the internet has basically fulfilled his prediction. Of course, it doesn't use microfilm, but essentially, it does meet all Wells's main requirements.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3.
Part 3.
You will hear a discussion between a student, Aldo, and his supervisor, Dr. Hurst, about his research assignment. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 23. Now listen to the first part of the conversation and answer questions 21 to 23.
So, Aldo, how's it going so far with your assignment?
Not too bad.
You're looking at the community round here.
That's right. How people perceive the community they are in.
Have you made much progress?
I conducted quite a lot of interviews on the street with local residents. Their responses are interesting. I haven't got quite as many yet as I'd like. I had wondered if I'd have language problems, particularly with the different accents. I seem to have managed, though. Having to work in the open has made it harder, and with the cold weather there's been recently, people don't necessarily want to stop and talk like they do if it's nice and sunny. That's something I've had to deal with. Of course, some people are too busy to stop and talk, but that's okay.
I see. So, have you formed a good overall picture of how people view the community?
To an extent. I've certainly talked to plenty of older people. I guess they may have more time to talk. I still don't really have enough young mothers, though. I've managed to get enough older mothers and children through the schools. That's something I had been worried about.
Well, that shouldn't be too hard. Now, how are you going to deal with all the data you've collected?
That's the difficult part. I guess I need to run some analyses, but I'm rather unclear about what methods to use.
You've told me you're confident about using computers, so you just need some input on choosing programs. You should attend a statistics seminar. They're held every Friday after the methodology seminars in room 105. That should help you to select an approach.
Oh, good. I'll do that.
Now you have some time to look at questions 24 to 30. Now you have some time to look at questions 24 to 30.
Meanwhile, let's hear something about what you've learned.
Yes, I talked to a number of residents.
Good. I imagine they didn't always have the same opinions.
Views were certainly quite mixed. Take sports facilities. In general, people seemed to think they weren't very good. There's no swimming pool in the area, for example. But at the same time, there's a new football training area. It looks very smart to me, but it doesn't seem to get used very much. People seem to prefer sitting around in the parks. They enjoy that, taking picnics and so on. Although they want the council to be more efficient at cleaning, there's a lot of litter. People are obviously very concerned about their children's learning. The general view seems to be that early schooling at primary level is of a good standard in the area, but that this standard declines as children move up through the system. The colleges were criticised in particular.
OK. Now, are you going to collect any more data?
Some, I hope. There's a local festival next week, and I think the events there will give me some useful opportunities. I talked to a council officer about it all.
Good. What does it involve?
First, there's a dance show, which I'm sure I'll enjoy. The council explained that the concert hall's being renovated and won't be ready in time, so it's being held in the main square, which I think will be better anyway. At least I'll have more space to wander around in.
True.
And so I hope to be able to carefully watch the age groups that are there in the audience and make notes about how they interact. So that's one event. Then the following day there's another interesting event which I look forward to going along to, and that's a cookery competition.
Oh, yes. Interesting.
I think so. Yes, that one's being organised in the town hall, which has a big space apparently. With food and cooking from all the different people in the area, the council officer told me that it'll be a good chance to find out about the different cultures that make up the community.
Sounds promising.
Then there's one more event I'd like to go along to. The council officer promised me that the courses fair will be interesting. It's going to be in the Langtree Theatre, and the officer said lots of teachers will be there. I've already talked to plenty of them, but he advised me to put some questions to the head of education, who will also be there.
That's all very useful. OK, I suggest you come back next week.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4.
You will hear a lecture about wind energy.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
With the rising cost of fossil fuels, there's a great deal of interest these days in developing alternative sources of energy. Today, I'd like to talk about one of these, wind power. In the past couple of decades, there's been an upsurge of interest in using the wind as a source of energy. But the idea isn't new at all. People have been harnessing the power of the wind for centuries, ever since ancient peoples first used sailboats. In ancient China, farmers used a rudimentary sort of windmill to pump water. Wind power was used in other parts of the ancient world as well. In Persia, for example, farmers used wind-powered mills to grind their grain. During the Middle Ages, in the Netherlands, people went back to the ancient idea of using the power of the wind to move water. They used windmills to drain lakes, thereby creating more land for farming. At present, people around the world are using the wind to generate electricity, some old methods, some new. Is this the solution to our modern energy problems? Well, as with anything, there are both advantages and disadvantages to using wind power. Let's take a look at some of the reasons to use wind power. One of the biggest problems with using fuels, such as oil and coal, is pollution. Wind power, on the other hand, is clean. It causes no pollution and therefore doesn't contribute to global warming. Another great advantage of wind power is that it's a renewable resource. Oil and coal reserves are limited, but will never run out of wind. Economics is another reason to use wind power. Using the wind to generate electricity costs less, much less, than running other types of generators. In addition, since wind turbines don't take up much land, the land around them can be used for other purposes, such as farming. There are disadvantages, however. Even though generating electricity with wind is relatively inexpensive, the technology isn't cheap. The initial costs of setting up wind turbines can be quite high. Another issue is reliability. Wind doesn't blow at a constant strength. Therefore, at times, a lot of electricity can be produced, while at others there may be little or none. Wind turbines usually have to be located in rural areas where the land is open. Their distance from cities, where the most electricity is needed, is another issue. Although wind is considered to be a clean source of energy, wind turbines cause their own sort of pollution. Wind turbines are usually placed in high, open areas where they're easy to be seen. Rural residents often feel that the beautiful local scenery is spoiled by the sight of the wind turbines. In addition, wind turbines aren't quiet. In fact, one wind turbine can produce as much noise as a car travelling at highway speeds.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.